In our final few topics for Module 6, we're going to examine the fluid compartments of the body, as well as some of the basic physiology of electrolytes in the cells and tissues, as well as acid-base balance in the body. So there are two main fluid compartments in the human body, the intracellular fluid compartment and the extracellular fluid compartment. The intracellular fluids are the fluids that are found within all of the cells of the body combined. The extracellular fluids are those found external to the cells, and these extracellular fluids are the fluids that bathe the exterior of the cells in the tissues, as well as the fluid that's found in the blood plasma. So in total, the body contains about 40 liters of water. 25 of those 40 liters belong to the intracellular fluid compartment, and 15 of those 40 liters belongs to the extracellular fluid compartment. So water is really important to the body because it functions as the liquid medium in which the chemical reactions that sustain life can take place. Chemically, we would describe water functioning as a solvent, which means that it has the ability to dissolve other substances into smaller particles. Water also suspends those smaller particles, what we call solutes, and those are the solutes that sustain and support life. The term solute refers to the substances that are dissolved in the body's fluid water compartments. Solutes can be described as either electrolytes or non-electrolytes, and we're going to discuss what both of those are right now. We'll first begin with the electrolytes, and the electrolytes are substances, for example salts, that dissolve into particles that are called ions, which are electrically charged particles and are capable of conducting an electrical current through a solution like water. This property is really critical for creating the electrical changes across the plasma membrane that drive neuron action potentials and drive muscle action potentials, so that both of those systems can function as they are designed to. So not only are electrolytes important for functions like the nervous system and the muscles, they are also molecules that create a greater osmotic power or a greater osmotic pull than non-electrolytes, which makes them really important in fluid balance between the cells and the tissues of the body. So the reason for this is that when electrolytes dissolve in water, they dissolve or dissociate into two or more particles. So for example, sodium chloride will dissolve or dissociate into positively charged sodium ions and negatively charged chloride ions. So from that one molecule, we get two dissolved particles, or two dissolve. When they dissolve, we have two substances or two particles that come from a single substance that has been dissolved in that water. In the extracellular fluid, the major cation, which is the major positively charged ion, is sodium, and the major anion, which is the major negatively charged electrolyte, is chloride. In the intracellular fluid, the major positively charged cation is potassium, and the major negatively charged anion is a phosphate molecule. So this chart here summarizes the important ions that are found in the blood plasma, which is shown in red, in the tissue or the interstitial fluid, which is shown in blue, and the intracellular fluid, which is shown in yellow. The major positively charged ions that are found in both the blood plasma and the interstitial or the tissue fluid is sodium, which is abbreviated Na+. That's shown on the far left side of this chart. This makes sense because the interstitial fluid comes from the blood plasma. That is, the interstitial fluid originates from the blood plasma because it's simply fluid that has been pushed by hydrostatic blood pressure out of the body's capillaries and into the space surrounding the cells of the various tissues. So because of its origin from the blood plasma, the chemistry of the interstitial fluid somewhat reflects the same chemistry as the blood plasma. So it isn't important to memorize the actual concentration numbers of the solutes here. Just know that the taller the bar is on the graph here, the greater the concentration of that electrolyte in that particular fluid compartment. Moving on, we see that the major positively charged ion that's found in the intracellular fluid that is inside of the cells is potassium, which is abbreviated K+. And that's shown in the tall yellow bar located towards the left-hand side of this graph. The major negatively charged ion, that is the anion in the blood plasma, as well as the interstitial or tissue fluid, is chloride, as we mentioned earlier, which is abbreviated Cl-. And the major negatively charged ion that's found in the intracellular fluid is the phosphate ion, which is abbreviated HPO4. So now that we've examined the major electrolytes, we can turn our attention to the non-electrolytes. In contrast to the electrolytes, the non-electrolytes are typically organic molecules that are still vitally important for body function, but when they are placed in water, they do not dissolve or dissociate into two or more charged particles. A couple of examples of non-electrolyte but still important substances in the body are things like glucose, lipids, and urea. Those are non-electrolyte substances, so they can, for the most part, with the exception of lipids, can be dissolved in water, but they do not dissociate into one or more charged particles. How does fluid move between the various body compartments? So there are two pressures, osmotic and hydrostatic pressure, that facilitate the exchange and mixing of the fluids between the various body fluid compartments. Osmotic pressure means that if the concentration of solutes becomes greater in one fluid compartment compared to another fluid compartment, water is going to move by osmosis toward the location where the solute concentrations are higher. This is typical of water moving between the fluid compartment of the cells, that is the intracellular fluid, and the interstitial fluid, which is the tissue fluid that is found bathing the exterior of the cells. So we typically see osmotic pressure pulling water either out of the cells and into the tissue fluid, or water being pulled from the tissue fluid into the cells by crossing the plasma membrane of those cells. The second pressure is hydrostatic pressure, and hydrostatic pressure means that if there is a pressure or a force that is greater on one side of a barrier, such as a wall of a blood vessel or a plasma membrane, then fluid is going to move from an area of high hydrostatic pressure to an area of low hydrostatic pressure. So this is typical of how water or fluid moves from the blood capillaries into the tissues, because the blood pressure, which is a hydrostatic pressure, pushes water out of the capillaries and into the tissue space. So the exchange between blood plasma and the interstitial fluid typically occurs across capillary walls and is typically caused by a hydrostatic pressure caused by the blood pressure that's in the capillaries. Meanwhile, the exchange between the interstitial fluid, that is the tissue fluid, and the intracellular fluid typically occurs across the cell membrane and is typically occurs by osmosis. So the osmotic pull of various electrolytes and concentrations of those electrolytes across the plasma membrane is what's going to determine which direction water moves across that membrane. So now we'll examine water balance. In order to achieve fluid or water balance in the body, of course, input of water from food or beverages has to equal the losses through sweat, through the urinary system, through the digestive system, and losses through the respiratory system as well. A typical person requires, on average, about 2,500 milliliters of fluid per day in order to maintain normal baseline homeostasis. So for humans, we typically obtain most of our fluids from beverages that we consume, and to a lesser extent, the foods that we eat. On the left, we see the average daily intake of about 2,500 milliliters in total, and where that 2,500 milliliters typically comes from. Most of it, roughly 60% of that 2,500 milliliters, comes from the beverages that we drink, with 30% of the fluid coming from the moisture that is found in the foods that we consume. About 10% of our daily water comes from metabolism, so that is when oxygen is metabolized in order to create ATP energy in the mitochondria of our cells. Water is created as a waste product, and our body is then able to use that. But because it's such a low amount of the water that we need daily, we cannot survive on the water created by metabolism alone. That's why we have to consume foods and beverages in order to obtain most of our daily water requirements. Now on the right, we see the typical sources of water loss from the body. Most of that loss, approximately 60%, comes from the loss of water through the urine or in the urine. The second largest source of water loss is evaporation from the skin or loss of water vapor from the lungs when we exhale. Sweat loss, of course, varies with external temperature as well as humidity, but typically sweat accounts for less than 10% of our daily water loss. Meanwhile, very little is lost to the feces. So the digestive system likes to keep a little bit of water in the fecal material so that they are able to move through the large intestine. So all these sources of water or fluid loss are what we call obligatory. That is, water is lost naturally through the normal processes and the functions of those organ systems, and therefore it's not preventable. So this explains why humans have to consume water each day in order to keep up with those obligatory water losses.